The main causes of the American Revolution were unfair treatment by Britain. First, the Stamp Act of 1765 put tax on all commercial and legal documents. This led to a debate on whether Britain could tax Americans without the representation. The overall American anger caused the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770, when Americans formed an angry crowd and British soldiers in Boston shot and killed 5 Americans. Also because of the monopoly by the East India Trading Company on colonial tea trade, Bostonians dumped tea in the Boston harbor. The British responded to rebellion by instituting the Coercive Acts, which closed Boston ports. This sparked the first meeting of the Continental Congress, which argued concessions against the Crown. Fighting began in Lexington and Concord in April 1775. Thus, the Revolution had begun.
Thomas Jefferson and other Continental Congress members drafted the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which listed grievances against George III and claimed independence.
The French, Dutch, and Spanish all shortly thereafter declared war on Britain. The French aided American military with ammunition due to difficult tensions after the 7 Years' War. Many battles happened, including the First and Second Battles of Saratoga, and a decisive victory of the Americans with the surrender of Yorktown by the British General Cornwallis. Following this, in the Treaty of Paris, Britain recognized American independence and granted territory between Allegheny Mountains and the Mississippi River. America then created the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention, which included checks and balances and established classic liberalism. Many amendments have been added, including the Bill of Rights, right after the Constitution was adopted. Other amendments include the 13th, which abolished slavery.
The French Revolution was from 1789 to 1799, where the monarchy fell and the establishment of a French Republic ultimately failed. The origins of the French Revolution were due to the fact that France was in debt from helping America win the Revolution, and the monarchy was spending lots of money on personal affairs, not helping the situation, and the representative system repressed the Third Estate. The Estates General was made up of 3 classes. The First Estate was made up of the clergy, which was 1% of the population. The Second Estate was the nobility with 2% of the population, and the Third Estate was everyone else, which was 97% of the population. Of the Third Estate, there was the urban middle class, the bourgeoisie, and the peasants. Each estate got 1 vote, and oftentimes the clergy and nobility would side together and heavily tax the Third Estate, which greatly angered them.
When Louis XVI called an Estates General in 1789, the Third Estate refused to participate until the clergy and nobility sat with them in a singular body. Some priests joined the Third Estate, and they voted to call themselves the National Assembly. On June 20th, the Third Estate was locked out of the hall, so they went into a tennis court next door and swore the famous tennis court oath. The oath stated that the National Assembly would not disband until a new constitution was written. Now, people in Paris at this time were starving, unemployed, and scared the king would come and sack the city with the army. So on July 14, 1789, Paris citizens stormed the Bastille to try and arm themselves with guns and gunpowder. The citizens were violent and hacked the governor in charge of the Bastille to death. Now that the revolution was in full throttle, nobles were scared to go out to the countryside because of the peasant rioting and stealing from nobles. This was called the Great Fear, and it was a general panic.
The National Assembly wrote and approved the Declaration of the Rights of Man on August 26, 1789. This stated, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and mankind's rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression." However, the King and Marie Antoinette were still living in the Palace of Versailles, not going hungry, while many people were starving because of high bread prices. This upset a lot of women, and on October 5, 1789, 7,000 women marched from Paris to Versailles and slaughtered the guards in search of the Queen, who is also known as Madame Deficit. They demanded the king go live in Paris, so Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette left for Paris and never returned.
After the king moved to Paris, the National Assembly demanded a constitutional monarchy. They abolished nobility, gave women some limited rights, converted to the metric system, gave religious freedom to the Jews and Protestants, and sold church property. They also made the clergy take an oath of loyalty, which only about half of them took. This caused a long division between church and state.
The beginning of the constitutional monarchy in France. However, after Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were caught trying to flee to Austria, the two were arrested and France declared war on Austria. France faced the First Coalition, which was an alliance between Austria and Prussia, and the war sparked nationalism throughout France. With the king on trial for treason, the National Convention met for the first time, declaring France a republic in September 1792. The National Convention seats would be voted for by universal male suffrage. The two main political parties were the Mountain, a radical group which sat on the upper far left side, led by Robespierre and Danton, and the Girondists, a more conservative group. King Louis was tried for treason and sentenced to death by the National Convention in September 1783 by the guillotine. The guillotine was popular at this time because it symbolized everyone being put to death equally.
The sudden shift in government leadership left many common laboring workers unable to support themselves. The Sans-Culottes, or without breeches, stirred on by Jacques Roux, were members of the working-class poor that demanded economic and political reform. Maximilien Robespierre, leader of the Mountain Group of the National Convention, responded to the Sans-Culottes' cries by instituting a planned economy during his reign of terror. During the terror, Robespierre used the new planned economy, tried political rebels, and encouraged nationalism in order to solidify the home front during the war with the First Coalition. However, Robespierre went too far. Although he secured a French victory against the First Coalition, he executed and arrested nearly 40,000 political subservies. He killed many of his collaborators, including Danton. Members of the National Convention organized a conspiracy against him, and on July 28, 1794, Robespierre was executed by the National Razor.
In the Thermidorian reaction, the upper middle class came back to power and abolished the economic controls from Robespierre's planned economy. A lack of economic controls caused the gap between the laboring poor and the indulgent upper class to expand, as the lower classes were unable to compete in a market without support from the government. Women also helped to bring Catholicism back to French culture. Finally, a reorganized legislative assembly was elected, which included a 5-man executive called the Directory, which was, for all intents and purposes, a dictatorship after they used the army to suppress election results, thus causing the representative government to fail. However, this dictatorship was weak, and Napoleon Bonaparte would later take power in a coup d'etat to establish a strong dictatorship in place of the Directory.
Mary Wollstonecraft was a women's rights activist and writer of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman and A Vindication of the Rights of Man, and Olympe de Gouges was a women writer who portrayed Wollstonecraft's ideas. Edmund Burke was a conservative writer who defended inherited privileges and wrote Reflections on the Revolution in France,